G'day everyone, it's Ben here. Before we get into today's episode, which is excellent, we've got a very special introduction. Now, for long-term listeners, you may recall way back in Season 2, Episode 18, we spoke with Rick Pedley-Smith and talked with him about the incredible work that he's doing with young boys, high school boys, particularly those from troubled backgrounds, maybe disturbed homes, etc. Rick has pioneered a rite of passage program to help give these boys a bit more of a head start on life. He uses physical and intellectual vectors to really demonstrate what it means to be a good man in today's world. Now, I was recently really honoured to be invited by Rick to sit in on a session he was running where the boys discussed the poem If. Clearly, that's one that's really close to our hearts through the name of this podcast, and so it was excellent to hear these young men's reflections on the poem itself. But Rick had also challenged them to find another poem that talks about manhood, victory, defeat, or adversity. We got some cracking examples, things like Invictus, which is another favourite of ours, and a couple of other really insightful pieces of poetry. But one really caught my attention. One of the boys in the group, Jackson, had not only looked for another poem about manhood, victory, defeat or adversity, but he'd actually gone so far as to write his own. Jackson had collected inspirational quotes, thoughts, ideas, mantras that resonated with him and put them together in an original poem. It moved me so much that I asked Jackson and Rick for their permission to use it on the show, and I'm delighted to open this week's show with Jackson reciting his poem.
Hi, I'm Jackson, and this is the poem I wrote. Don't light yourself on fire to keep others warm. Even the strongest man can still be torn. Don't worry about people who talk behind your back. They're there for a reason. You have the best potential and nobody can seize it. One day or day one, you decide. Be afraid and do it anyway. Fall 7 times and get up 8 and work through the tough days. If you feel like God isn't there, remember the teacher is silent during the test, and no matter what you do, life will throw you out of the nest.
Welcome to the Unforgiving 60 with your hosts, Ben Pronk and Tim Curtis. As two ex-SAS guys armed with MBAs, Ben and Tim seek out people leading lives less ordinary and talk with them about how they fill their unforgiving minutes and what helps them go, always, a little further. Like intellectual bowerbirds, we aim to collect shiny little objects of knowledge that we think can help build better humans.
G'day everyone, and welcome to the Unforgiving 60 podcast. I am Ben Pronk.
And I am Tim Curtis.
And we, way back in March, saw a really interesting article online talking about the impacts of early lifehood stress on your brain, the actual changes and sometimes the positive changes that can be made within people's brains as a result of stress and their adaptation to it. And this got us really interested in talking to the lead researcher of that paper,
Dr. Justine Gatt. Justine herself is a PhD psychologist. She has worked at University of New South Wales and the University of Sydney, amongst other locations, and her whole thesis has been wellbeing and resilience. She has an excellent little model that she calls COMPAS-W. Composure, own worth, mastery, positivity, achievement, satisfaction. And those aspects comprise well-being.
Yeah, and quite interestingly comprise a sort of broad-reaching model of well-being, which we're going to talk to Justine about. We're also going to discover how good she is at coming up with acronyms.
Very good.
Cool names for things. Yeah. But also some of her other fascinating research, in addition to the stuff on early lifehood stress and the neuroplastic impacts of that. Justine is doing a research project on the impacts of social media, and particularly Instagram use, on adolescent well-being, and has done a longitudinal study, an ongoing study, with over 1,600 twins. And I'm really interested in working out if she's found if they've got any superpowers.
The twinsies. Well, and of course, we can't let an opportunity go by to any researcher on the subject of resilience to ask the question, what does Associate Professor Justine Gatt do for herself?
Yeah, interesting to see how she applies some of her hard-won research secrets in her own life.
Exactly. Let's get on with the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Unforgiving 60 podcast.
I'm Tim Curtis.
And I'm Ben Pronk, and Tim and I are joined this week by Professor Justine Gatt. Justine, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Very well. Now, frequent listeners, of which there are a few, couple, of the podcast will know we're really interested in this concept of resilience and have sort of really been fascinated by the constituent elements. Justine's research, your research is basically anchored on this as well, and we're really keen to talk about your work in the resilience and wellbeing space. But before we do, could you share with our listeners how you got to where you are today, a bit about your sort of early childhood and what got you interested in these sorts of topics?
That's a big question. Where my journey started, I did a psychology degree at the University of Sydney. I guess the whole time I was studying, I had in my mind that I was training to be a clinical psychologist. But just before I was deciding on whether or not I would actually do a master's course to do that, I changed my mind and I went down the research pathway. And so I did a PhD instead. And that PhD focused on links between personality and stress and chronic disease.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, I did a postdoc, which is like a research position in a neuroscience lab. Funnily enough, neuroscience was my worst subject at university, but I ended up in that area and I really loved it because it's quite a challenging area to be in, focusing on the brain and trying to understand it and how it impacts our behaviors. And so my initial research actually focused on predicting anxiety and depression.
Okay.
So we'll try and understand the genetics and the brain patterns behind these particular symptoms. And so I was doing that for a few years, and I just started to think, maybe there's a different way to look at this problem. And one thing in particular I noticed was that, there are a lot of people who are trauma exposed, but don't necessarily go on to develop anxiety and depression as an illness. And so I wondered, okay, well, what are these people doing differently? Or what is it about them that's different? And what do we understand about them? And so I looked in the neuroscience field, and there was actually so little focus on at the time trying to understand these patterns in these people who I define as flourishing and doing really well. And so that's where I shifted gears, and that's where I've been focusing ever since. And it's been an amazing journey.
So you're currently the lead scientist at the Gatt Wellbeing and Resilience Group, and kudos, that is so cool having a wellbeing and resilience group named in your honour. Love it. How do you define wellbeing and resilience? Part of our research, it was interesting looking at the different perspectives on and how differently people look at these two topics. But what do you view
as a working definition of those two terms?
Yes, so well-being and resilience, they're highly related, but I guess they focus on different aspects. So well-being, as I define it, and as most people define it, it's, I guess, the state of positive mental health. And you can have two, I guess, subcomponents of well-being. So there's subjective well-being and psychological well-being. And so they define things such as your happiness, levels of optimism, satisfaction with life, as well as the psychological well-being aspects. So that's talking about your levels of autonomy, confidence, goal striving, achievement, and those kind of things. Then when we talk about resilience, it's more about the process of positive adaptation. Mm-hmm. So it's all the steps we take, or, you know, our genetics, our environment, our coping strategies, but also things external to us that help us deal with any particular stressful life event, so that we can return back to that state of well-being that we were at, or hopefully improve it from that prior to that event. So you can see they're related concepts, but quite different.
And by your definition, well-being is more than just the absence of, I guess, negative affect, is it? It's actually, you use the word positive. It's actually, I guess, proactive and positive aspects of people's approach to life.
Yes, definitely. So if we think about mental health, the broad concept of mental health, it involves mental illness, which is where usually the focus often is. Mm-hmm. But it also includes well-being. So well-being is not simply, or mental health is not simply the absence of illness symptoms. It's also the presence of well-being.
Yeah.
Research, mm-hmm. as well as in treatment. So if you, for example, go and visit a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and they might look at your symptoms of mental illness, and they would track that usually during treatment. But what's often less done is actually track your levels of well-being in sync. And so that's what we're trying to actually push a little bit more.
It's reminiscent, and I'm going to mess the terms up here, but early in the piece, in the CrossFit sort of approach, they spoke about illness, wellness and fitness, was it, Tim?
Yeah.
Anyway, but this idea that you can be sick, you can be normal, but you can also be more positive. And it sounds like this is what we're talking about here. It's not just not being sick, not being mentally ill in this case, but it's about actually, you used that word flourishing before, it's about actually being in that forward-leaning, that positive aspect.
Yes, definitely.
A lot of your work, or some of your work, has looked at, I guess, the hereditability of well-being, and I was really interested to read your conclusion that about half, 48% of well-being is hereditable. We certainly view within our innate layer of our sort of construct, there is a massive genetic component and, in fact, epigenetic component to resilience. Can you talk more about what sort of aspects are hereditary when it comes to well-being and resilience?
Well, I guess that particular finding that you mentioned, it's related to a well-being scale that we created.
This is the COMPAS-W?
Yes.
Maybe if you could explain that to set the scene, I think that'd be really useful for our listeners.
Okay. So the COMPAS-W is a wellbeing scale we developed back in 2014. And I guess the reason we developed it was we wanted to make sure we had a measure of wellbeing that measured both components of wellbeing, so both subjective and psychological wellbeing. As you'll find that, well, as we found, that there were a lot of questionnaires in the literature that only measured one or the other, often not both. So we wanted to make sure there was a nice comprehensive measure of wellbeing. And so this scale, it it creates a total score of well-being, but it also has 6 subdimensions. And so that's what COMPAS stands for, is those 6 subdimensions. So they are composure, so that's how we deal with stress, own worth, mastery, positivity, achievement, and satisfaction. So it's like satisfaction with life.
Kudos also on getting a really cool acronym out of those 6 components. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it took me a little while to create that, but it came together nicely.
No, it works really well.
Yeah, so we are, one of our, I guess, our largest studies is the twin study that we've been doing over 10 years. And because we created this scale and we had data in the twins, we could look at, the contribution of genetics and environment and how heritable well-being is. And so we found that overall heritability of well-being was 48%. So that's almost, 50-50 gene environment contribution. And then when we looked at the 6 subdimensions of the COMPAS scale, they ranged from, I believe, around 20 or 25% up to about
composure.
Yeah, that was, I think, the smallest, up to
satisfaction at 43.
Yes, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
So you can see that there's a little bit of variability in how much genes and environment contribute to each of those components. But at the end of the day, they're all, they have a large environment component. So that means they are largely malleable. And, there are a lot of things we can do to actually improve them.
Speaking of malleability, some of your research has looked at the impact of early life stressors on people, and there's been some really interesting findings in terms of the actual physical changes, the neuroplastic effects that this can have on people who've gone through that and been able to come out the other side in one piece. Can you talk to some of the ways our brains can change as a result of stress in early lifehood?
Yes. So when we talk about trauma, I guess to begin with, there are different types. So the most severe impact on our health and our brain and our behavior is childhood trauma. So that's any kind of severe trauma that has happened up to the age of 18. And
Justine, sorry, is this because that is a period of high neuroplastic change, that our brains are changing anyway? Is that linked to that?
Yes, definitely. So our brains are going through a whole lot of changes during development, all the way up to our early 20s. Mm-hmm. So our brain is not fully formed until our early 20s. So that means anything positive, but also negative, can really impact how your brain develops later on into adulthood. So it's such a crucial time for brain development, but also in adolescence, that's the peak onset period for mental health disorders. Mm. So you can see that it's also, the peak period when you want to intervene. But, when you're talking about trauma, the evidence is very clear that if you've experienced trauma in childhood versus adulthood, it's the childhood trauma that's more negatively impacting. Mm. And we see that in the brain as well. We did a study, for example, in our twin cohort where we compared those who had childhood trauma versus not. Mm-hmm. And there were clear differences in the brain, even though these people were all healthy. Mm-hmm. So I guess the good thing out of this is that even though you have this trauma and it changes your brain to some degree, it doesn't mean you necessarily go on to develop some sort of mental health problem. Mm. So there are other things in these people that I guess compensating for those experiences.
Justine, is it too simplistic to say that the people who were exposed to early lifehood stressors but had either support or coping mechanisms to work through that developed a stronger brain as a result, and you mentioned the temporal and parietal regions, the areas that are related to emotional and cognitive functioning seem to be more pronounced in these kind of people. But is it too simplistic to say that so people who have been exposed to trauma but who have been able to deal with it have a stronger brain from a resilient sense, whereas people who've been exposed to trauma without the tools to process and deal and the support may have lifelong impacts?
I don't think it's too simplistic. In that particular study, for example, we only tested a few different coping strategies, how that might have mediated those changes. Mm-hmm. And we found, for example, that cognitive reappraisal was one factor that mediated that connection. So this is quite an adaptive, I guess, coping strategy that people can use, and is just one thing that we tested, but there clearly would be others that are involved in that process. So there might be a little bit of protection from genetics or from other coping strategies that they use. In addition, there might be other things external to the person. So, if they had stronger family support, community support, financial support, medical support, all those things, spiritual support, whatever it is that they kind of draw on to deal with stress, as they go through life. Those are the things that all contribute to it. And I mean, this is kind of the goal of our project and our programs, trying to identify all those little bits, that we could do to actually promote it.
Following the methodology from our best-selling book, The Resilience Shield, we are delighted to announce the inaugural Resilience Retreat, which will occur in far north Queensland between Thursday the 27th of October and Sunday the 30th of October.
The whole point of the retreat is to give you the ability to build your shield, to develop your knowledge and understanding of the key principles related to resilience, to enhance your toolkit, and to optimise your performance.
Come and be part of an incredible group of humans that are like-minded, meet our facilitators and motivational speakers. To find out more, email us at retreat@resilientshield.com. Hope to see you there. How do we put those coping strategies in the practical hands of kids and or parents? I mean, can cognitive reappraisal be conducted outside of therapy with a psychologist or psychiatrist? Are there tips or techniques that are transferable into the family home?
Yeah, definitely. There are plenty of things that we can all do every day to actually try and promote these strategies. And I guess that's another interest of ours, is trying to actually create programs for people. And our target actually is non-clinical individuals. So, it's the person who might be considered healthy by medical dimensions, but might not necessarily, they might be struggling still, as you probably, we've all experienced it now in the past couple of years during COVID, where, we might not necessarily meet criteria for some sort of illness, but we're still,
we're not flourishing.
Yeah, exactly. Most of us, actually, over 60% of the population are in that moderate to languishing category, even though they have no diagnosed illness.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that we could do outside of the clinical room to promote these kind of adaptive coping styles.
Any sort of examples that leap readily to mind?
Yes. So we kind of created a framework around the COMPAS scale. So each of those dimensions you can actually target. So if when we measure it in the research setting and we can see, okay, this particular person is lower on this dimension, and these are the sort of things that we would recommend to do to promote that particular dimension. So, for example, I'm trying to think of a couple of examples. So with own worth, for example. So that's that's kind of linked to your self-esteem and, your values and how you try and preserve them. One particular activity that is useful for that is called self-compassion. So this is an activity that anyone can do. We've even tested it in the lab with university students. And it's a positive psychology technique where it's about self-talk and how you talk to yourself when things go wrong. We naturally, when we fail at something, we kind of put ourselves down. But if, say, your friend or your family member went through exactly the same experience, what would you say to them? You wouldn't say the same kind of things that we say to ourselves, right? We're pretty harsh on ourselves.
You would run out of friends very quickly, I reckon, if you,
So this whole self-compassion technique is about being aware of how you talk to yourself and changing that dialogue. And that's something that easily can be taught in kids or adults.
I think it was a guy called Ethan Cross wrote a book called Chatter talking about self-talk, and one of the things that stuck with me is he did a series of experiments where people were instructed to talk to themselves in the third person, almost to provide that distance. And
can you give us an example of that, Ben?
Ben walked into the room, scanned for threats. But what he said is that it helped with that. It distanced people so they wouldn't talk to another human being like the way they talk to themselves, and they became more self-compassionate as a result. But as Tim mentions, we do not recommend talking about yourself in the third person out loud.
That's right. One of the interesting things from the University of Western Australia publishing the findings of our survey was a little gap in our game, he says, looking at Ben, on the importance of geosocial stability, that if a person is brought up in the same location, it might contribute more positively to their resilience. Is that a school of thought that you would subscribe to based on your research, Justine?
Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so that if you're born and raised in the one location rather than being a transient child, that you are likely to be more resilient by virtue of the fact that that one location has solidified certainly a lot of your social experience, that you've got a strong connection to it.
I think it was more just saying that maybe we hadn't accounted for that.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. But as you delve more into that, there's an interesting subset that drops out. You're looking at two people here, Justine, that did move around a lot. Both of our parents were in the military, so we tended to move every 2, 3, 4 years. Yeah. And I wonder if that contributes to diminishing our resilience a bit.
I don't think so necessarily. I think it depends potentially on the person. We actually ran a study in youth across 6 countries, and we actually compared migrant versus non-migrant youth. So they may have migrated in the past year with their family, and some of the countries, we expected there would be more harder living, I guess you could say. And so we predicted that those who were migrant children might demonstrate, lower well-being simply because they might have the trauma they might have experienced where they were moving from might have contributed to that. But in actual fact, we found the opposite. So we found that though there were as compared to those kids who were non-migrants, there were migrant children who actually showed higher resilience. And so, this was not over a period of time, it was just a single point in time. So we're wondering, so there's something in these kids that, and it might have been, the families, because they were able to move, they had the financial means to do so, or whatever other resources they needed. Where the issue these kids had, actually, it was just more assimilating into their school. So, language differences or, changes in their friendships. And that was more where the difficulty was. It wasn't in terms of the well-being or resilience. So, I don't think necessarily living and staying in the same place necessarily means you're going to be more resilient or not. Yeah, I think it depends.
Speaking of youth, we interviewed David Gillespie on our podcast a little while ago, who wrote a really fascinating book called Teen Brain about the impacts of social media on developing, and we've just spoken about the fact our brains haven't developed until we're sort of early 20s, on developing adolescent brains and some of the insidious tricks that have been developed by the sort of big social media labels to sort of captivate people and trigger sort of dopamine-driven responses. I understand you're conducting a body of research into Instagram use and adolescent well-being. Have you got any sort of reflections on what we know already about the potential impacts on resilience and well-being related to social media use?
Yes, so we did run a large study. We are still analysing that data, but some of the preliminary results that came out of that study, and this in particular study, it compared Australian and American youth. There was about 2,500 children and young adults from 13, I think, up to 25 years. They participated. And we found that, and this is generally the trend that you would find with social media use, is that if you're a more active user rather than a passive user, so passive use is where you're just scrolling and not really participating or, contributing to conversations or posting yourself. It's the more passive use that's actually linked to poorer health outcomes, whereas the more active use is actually better.
Better than sort of no use, or better than just compared to the passive use?
Better than the passive use, yeah. I think it's hard to find people these days who don't use it. Actually, there's about, and we found this the same in our own data, that about 75% of the sample were using some sort of social media platform. So that's consistent with what you would find. And the funny thing is, with that particular study, it actually fell during COVID. So while we were initially focusing on social media, we ended up first initially focusing then on the impact of COVID and social isolation on youth. And so that was kind of where our focus first kind of went in terms of the data analysis. So yeah, we haven't published those findings as yet.
Was there any reason that drew you to Instagram as the platform of choice for the research?
Well, Instagram was actually giving out research grants to, they were actually interested in seeing the impact of Instagram on wellbeing. So that was a great opportunity.
It's fascinating. I thought that Netflix show Social Dilemma, which talks about, the impacts and, interviews a number of Silicon Valley founders. The overwhelming impression I got was that no one was deliberately trying to sort of get kids addicted or manipulate people's brains or do anything of that nature. But by trying to make these platforms more efficient and stickier and, keep people scrolling, they'd accidentally stumbled across some of these techniques that were essentially causing addiction. And yeah, it's interesting. I think that was interesting to hear you just say that they are, Instagram at least are looking at the potential impacts.
Yeah, I mean, when I speak, for example, to in education settings or teachers, or parents, there's a lot of concern about, overall screen time use in children. And one interesting study that I actually found, what they've termed as the Goldilocks hypothesis. So they looked at the amount of time on screen time each day in terms of links with mental health outcomes. And they found that an absence of screen time was actually worse than having an ideal amount, which was about 1 to 2 hours a day. So it went to like a peak. And then after that 1 to 2 hours a day, it just sort of diminished, in terms of your mental health, positive mental health. And so there is an actual ideal amount of screen time, and this could be any form of screen time. But what they, I think, attributed that to was because that screen time involved interaction with others.
Yeah.
And so, it's the connection with others online, which is actually quite useful for youth and adults, when they, if they had an absence of that. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting to explore the positive aspects of social media on the more popular platforms, and I watch my kids interacting with their friends on social media, and there's certainly some interesting aspects that might contribute to wellness and well-being. And I come back to Snapchat, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of the platform, but the Snap Maps. So they can jump on and see where their friends happen to be, and if they're in close proximity, they can reach out and use that as a vehicle to, in real life, in-person connection. Is there value there from a wellbeing perspective?
It's a good question. I'm not really sure. I haven't looked into it, but I have a similar. I don't use Snapchat, but I have a similar. I use an app, like a map app, I guess, with my daughter, and we can see where each other are on the map, and so she can see, for example, when I'm driving, like it's a little driving icon. I'm driving to get her from school, and I don't know, there's a certain level of, I guess, satisfaction or comfort with that. And I guess you could expand that to peers.
Yeah, we were pretty negative, weren't we, Ben, at the start on social media, but as time progresses, we recognise that there is value for minority and marginalised groups to be able to find some sense of online community. I mean, we've talked about those who are struggling to find their own identity, whether it's their sexuality, but being able to find a like-minded community with some level of anonymity could be highly beneficial. And then using that platform, whichever the preferred platform happens to be, to connect to other like-minded people in real life, it probably does contribute to wellbeing.
Yeah, and I think, Justine, your point earlier, you can't find a sample size of people who don't use this. It's not a matter of saying, we should get rid of social media. It's here, and I think what you've just described, let's look at the optimal way. And I'm pretty bullish on, I guess, screen time and access to internet and that sort of stuff. I've got a teenage daughter and a 10-year-old boy, and my goodness, they are so much more worldly, so much more able to access humankind's knowledge and to find things out and to sort of understand things, which is incredible. It's amazing. And, you need to temper aspects of that, because there's stuff that I think they're not ready to be exposed to. And I think some of those sort of more insidious aspects of how some of the algorithms work are particularly, or children are particularly vulnerable to that. But yeah, it's here to stay. And I think this kind of discussion and the education and the kind of research you're doing is really positive in terms of understanding how to capitalise on what's, I think, fundamentally a really positive sort of thing in our society.
Yes, definitely.
So where to next? You've got a number of projects that are ongoing. You're sort of progressing towards developing a lot of tools and a lot of, I guess, accessible ways for people to track and monitor and develop aspects of their well-being and resilience. Where does sort of Justine Gatt, the Gatt Centre, Neuro sort of progress in the next 12, 18, 24 months?
Yes, so we're doing a lot of parallel projects. So our twin cohort, that's, I guess, our largest one, that's we're doing a 10-year follow-up on them. So these twins we looked at back in 2009, and now we're re-looking at them and, their mental health now and their physical health now and how their brain looks. And so we're trying to, when we finish collecting that data, we would look at we'll try and create resilience and risk profiles. And so we'll see, the trajectories of those people over time and how their brains look and what, predicts those trajectories.
Justine, can I ask, on twins, Have you discovered whether they are able to read each other's minds?
I don't know, but some of them are really identical and they like to be.
Yep.
We actually have part of our questionnaire actually asks about that. So we even ask a few questions about that. Yeah.
Right,
We haven't
right.
looked at the data yet, but it's an interesting question.
Superpowers.
Yeah. So that
the twin study.
Yeah. So when that's finished, we'll be able to create these trajectories, and these are in adult twins. And at the moment, we're trying to get funding to do the same thing in kids. So we want to look at children and adolescents and twins and see, what their resilience and risk profiles look like over time. And then separate to that, so that's our kind of neuroscience platform. Separate to that, we're actually also looking at more clinical applications. So these are in, the average non-clinical person for now. For example, we've got a program in healthcare workers. So we are creating this 7-week program to actually promote different healthy behaviours in different healthcare staff across hospitals in Sydney. So that's called the Thrive program, and that's a nice ongoing program that we're running. Another thing that we've been focusing on, it's quite a big thing, is a wellbeing app that we have called Renewal, and it's a play of words on resilience, neuroscience, and wellbeing. So that's why we called it Renewal.
You are good with the acronyms.
I like names. Names are good.
Well, they're important. I like it.
Yeah. So this app, it's designed for the average healthy adult, looking for ways to actually understand their well-being and ways to promote it. So within the app, it contains our well-being scale. So individuals actually get their own profile, and they would know which of their 6 domains they kind of need a bit more help in and which ones they're doing well in already. And then it creates a personalized program of activities. So each day they just do different types of activities that target each of those 6 dimensions. And, what we're trying to do is get them to use it for, say, 10 minutes a day. And hopefully, with that ongoing use and education, we find a nice way of actually promoting well-being in the average healthy person. So the app is, not currently yet launched. We're hoping to launch it in the next few months, but there is a website that individuals can go to and register their interest if they're interested in using the app.
Justine, personal question. When it comes to well-being and resilience, what do you do for you? What are your habits and practices that contribute to your well-being and resilience?
That's a good question. I say to my team, do as I say, not as I do.
Is it like the mechanic that has the worst car?
Yeah.
Or the builder that has the worst house?
Yeah. I try, I fall off the wagon many times, but I try and be definitely present and, aware of what I'm doing at that moment. I try and always express gratitude and appreciation for what I've got and what I have around me. My friends and family are really important to me, and so I always try and dedicate time with them. And I think for me, I love my work and I could keep working, day and night, but I think there's a time when I just like to just sort of cut off, that work-life balance and do things that I actually enjoy. One thing I often suggest to people is scheduling in fun, because my calendar is ridiculous, but I have in my calendar events that I've highlighted in yellow that are things I actually look forward to, and I schedule them in as you do with everything else. So there are a lot of things I do.
Was the Unforgiving 60 podcast highlighted in
yellow?
You went orange.
That's close. That's close. I like that, scheduling in fun. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Well, and not dissimilar, we spoke to Near AL about, time. He talks about time blocking and time boxing. You're right. And yeah, it's important because we become slaves to these calendars and we fill it with work stuff, which, I mean, Tim and I are both lucky. We both enjoy our jobs as well. But, there's other important stuff that really needs to get in there. And I like that idea of little yellow boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing that he says is you can time box your social media, you can time box your being bored, procrastinating, you can time box your work, you can time box your fun.
Like it.
What about your daughter? What are the transferable things that you're trying to incorporate in her life?
Well, I try and teach all these same kind of things to her.
Are you having any luck in that?
If you are, we need the recipe urgently.
She's often actually my guinea pig in my app testing. She's like, why would you do it that way? Mother, why?
You're lame, Dad.
Yeah. She's a very emotionally mature child for her age, and she teaches me a lot.
Awesome.
So, it's actually quite mind-blowing. Sometimes the things she would say, I'm like, yep, you are absolutely right. And so, it's a two-way transaction.
It's very cool. Well, Justine, in the spirit of gratitude, we are sincerely grateful for you sharing this time with us and the reflections on your research. Absolutely fascinating work. As I said, we sort of saw this article and thought we've got to reach out to Associate Professor Gatt, and we're very glad we've finally been able to line this up. So thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. It's been great fun.
Now to the debrief. We try to go always a little further in this podcast and greatly appreciate your input. Please let us know your feedback, the good, the bad, or the ugly. Also, if you know someone who is living a life less ordinary, we'd love to hear about them. You can get in touch at debrief@unforgiving60.com. That's debrief@unforgiving60.com. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends and write a review for us on Apple Podcasts. Until next episode, keep filling your unforgiving minutes with 60 seconds worth of distance run. See you next time on the Unforgiving 60.